Welcome to It's More Than Grit, the CSIS podcast about the crucial role entrepreneurs play in the global economy. I am Mariana Campero.
And I'm Andrew Schwartz. Join us as we hear stories of both triumphs and setbacks and how economic and policy environments across the globe shape their outcomes.
Let's dive in and learn why being a successful entrepreneur takes more than just grit.
In this episode, we interviewed Dr. Parag Khanna, a leading global strategy advisor and best-selling author, about Southeast Asia's dynamic entrepreneurial landscape.
It was so interesting to learn more about ASEAN nations. I hope you enjoyed this insightful conversation as much as we did. Parag, welcome to It's More Than Grit. Honestly, what a privilege to have the chance to speak with not only a geostrategic thinker and a student of global trends, but you're also a climate entrepreneur yourself with a very international background. I mean, you were born in India, grew up in the Arab Emirates, but also New York and Germany, and you're now living in Singapore. What can you tell us about the current trends that are creating or impacting the entrepreneurial ecosystem in the ASEAN region?
Likewise. Thank you so much, Mariana. Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to join you, and congratulations on the launch of this podcast. And I think it's great that CSIS, just so established in the arena of strategic affairs as a think tank and in policy, is broadening the horizons of how to think about global issues. I know that it has always had a very strong geoeconomic dimension, and entrepreneurship can be seen as a contributor to that. When we tend to think of those things as different, but when we're measuring power in countries today, one of the things that we look at, it doesn't matter how much weight we put on it, whether it's a lot or a little, but we're looking at it. What is the degree of economic freedom in a country? How much innovation is happening? What about research and development, not just in terms of government grants, but from the academic community in terms of patents that have been filed, for example, the number of startups, the number of venture capital firms? All of those things are important signals around how dynamic a society is, how innovative it is, and those are contributors to national power. One of the things that I wrote many years ago was the balance of power derives from the balance of innovation, right? The balance of innovation comes before the balance of power. If you want to look at the balance of power and measure these big numbers around military power and other kinds of influence among nations, start by looking at where they are innovative, because it is the balance of innovation that ultimately dictates the balance of power, not the reverse. And so it's time for strategic thinkers to be looking at that innovation. And where does that come from? It comes, of course, from entrepreneurs.
Parag, it's great to have you on and thinking about, this Southeast Asia, for instance. What are some of the entrepreneurial opportunities that make you most excited in that region?
Well, there are the things that are just inherently exciting about Southeast Asia itself. And then part of that story, of course, is that entrepreneurial dynamism that you're asking about. It's worth just giving a bit of a macro view for a moment. For those who don't know, Southeast Asia, which sometimes goes by the acronym ASEAN, is now the fourth or fifth largest economic area in the world, right? Think North America, European Union, China, India, ASEAN. But ASEAN's GDP is bigger than India's GDP, right? To be clear. So you have really these, of the principal economic regions of the world, three of them are in Asia: China, India, ASEAN. Don't forget Japan, of course, as well. So we need to include that too. So let's say four of the six, major economic regions of the world are really here in Asia. And Southeast Asia is the newest, the fastest growing among them, up and coming, and the youngest demographically as well, alongside India.
Also the most volatile, correct?
Yeah, that depends on kind of which specific geography. So, for example, geopolitically, looking at China's relations with some Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines or Indonesia even Vietnam, there's clearly a history of hostility and current discord among them for sure. But as a bloc, it's actually, and this is a super interesting point, it is actually China's second largest trading partner. Very often when I'm trying to explain China's worldview from an economic or strategic lens to other people, focusing just on trade, from the Chinese point of view, the US is not the most important trade relationship, right? The European Union is the largest trade relationship, and the second largest is ASEAN, and the United States is actually third, right? So it's important to see things from Asians' point of view, and within Asia, each of those principal subregions or powers. And so Southeast Asia is already so significant, right, as a major trading partner for China and a growing trading partner for everywhere else in the world too, because you see that it's a region that's central to America's de-risking strategy, diversification strategy for supply chains. Europe is doing the same thing. So you have a massive expansion of foreign investment into this region as well. And that's where the entrepreneurship piece comes in, because of course, a developing region doesn't just automatically have its moment in the sun. It's the result of being young, being open, trading more, attracting more investment, having more value-added industries, economic diversification. All of those things are percolating at the same time right here in Southeast Asia. So when it comes to entrepreneurialism, I've lived in the country of Singapore for about 12 years now, on and off. It's incredible if you compare a decade ago to today. It wasn't a region where everyone had a startup, and it's become that, almost overnight. And where the ecosystem was so vibrant across seed series A, all the way through the capital stack, where you had IPOs and all the regional exchanges, where you had so much cross-pollination across borders too. If you look at any startup company, sort of entrepreneurial venture in this region, so often what you'll find is that even when it looks like a small company in Indonesia, it's like, oh, well, actually, the holding company is in Singapore, and the investors are Japanese, Chinese, European, American, Saudi Arabian, and Indian.
Parag, let me just jump in for a second. How do businesses and entrepreneurs effectively navigate not only what you're describing as such a dynamic market, but also as a very, very diverse region? I mean, just to start, we're talking about 12 countries, hundreds of languages, 4 main religions, and very different types of governance. I mean, we have from absolute monarchies to presidential republics, even to Islamic states.
It's one of the magical things about this region. It's the most heterogeneous region in the world, again, linguistically, religiously, ethnographically, as you were saying. And that's so charming, and exotic about this region. And yet they have so many millennia of interaction with each other that there's almost just a reflex, this ability to navigate and get by. And we see it every day. We fly around, well, being in Singapore, you have to fly pretty much everywhere. So, you can cross one land border over a bridge to Malaysia, but what you find is this circulation of people. You now have visa-free mobility for people in the region. So Cambodians are going to Malaysia, and Vietnamese are going to the Philippines, and Indonesians are going to Thailand, and it's like crisscrossing all the time. In fact, almost all of the world's most dense airline connections are just in this immediate Asian region. And so you would think that with all this diversity, it would be very hard for them to transact with each other, but they have, again, this reflex, this intuition going back so many millennia of how to do business with each other despite that diversity, and in a way to think of it as a competitive advantage, right? There are not that many, say, Thai companies in Vietnam. And so when you are those companies from Thailand and Vietnam, you get to have that competitive advantage to be a first mover and build those bridges. So what's happening is everyone is building bridges to everyone else. But importantly, I'm holding up my smartphone, and that we have super apps. And this is key. As you know, Asia dominates the super app market in the world, whether it's the Chinese WeChat or Grab in this region. So when you go between Thailand and Indonesia and Singapore, you're still using the same app, even though it's different currencies. And everything is seamlessly integrated. So you can do mobile payments and taxi services and so on.
And in your language, I assume.
Yep, everything is indigenized to your language. You choose your language and so forth. So all of that is getting harmonized digitally. There's like, you could call it a middleware that is enabling this harmonization or frictionlessness of navigation. Now, I don't want to overstate it because it'll always be those 12 countries that you were referring to, these dozen countries. We're never going to have a supranational European Union style institution in this region. That said, the more you can reduce frictions through digital transactions and enabling free labor mobility and building more infrastructure and transportation networks the way they are doing so actively, the less friction there is. And so that's what we're seeing. I've called it the ASEAN dream. So many countries say there's the Chinese dream, the Indian dream, the American dream. So, here in this region, it's not the Indonesian dream and the Vietnamese dream. There is an ASEAN dream because there's a realization that they are each other's most significant, obviously, neighbors. That's never going to change. And they're also becoming more and more important investment and trade partners to each other as well.
You mentioned that Singapore is becoming a launching pad for startups and tech companies. Why is that happening? What's happening and why?
Well, one of the reasons I moved here is I called Singapore the capital of Asia. And I coined that phrase, again, more than a decade ago, way before it was as obviously true as it is today. In fact, back then, people would have said and did say, oh, you're crazy. It's all about Hong Kong. Obviously, no one would say that anymore, given how captured and in a way undermined Hong Kong has been at the hands of mainland China and Beijing in the last decade. So Singapore is now de facto the capital of Asia, and that alone carries its own weight. It's obviously one of the best governed countries in the world when it comes to rule of law, so it always had that natural advantage. And it has a huge amount of state capital and a very educated society. So, the ingredients have been there. And at some point, some strategic decisions were made, both in public and private sectors, to really emphasize innovation, entrepreneurship, venture capital, choosing or deploying capital to strategic sectors where they viewed Singapore as a logical anchor, like obviously financial technology, because it's a major financial center and a global capital hub. And of course, the growth of the region itself. I gave an anecdote earlier about, you scratch an Indonesian company and you get a Singapore registered company. Well, that's really true of every other country in the region as well. They're going to have either a Singapore headquarters or Singapore affiliate, have their taxation, registration, fiduciary, licensing, all these accounting, board meetings, and capital raising happen in Singapore for all of those same logical regulatory reasons. So Singapore benefits immediately just by the region growing. And so this just reinforces itself as a hub. Just one anecdote, again, I've been visiting the region for 25 years. And when I was just a backpacker around then, I would go to Kuala Lumpur and Bangkok and Jakarta. And people would say to me, the wise, the esteemed, the journalists, the academics, the policymakers, the mayors, the governors, in all those other countries, they would say, oh, Singapore is going to be crushed. Look at how much bigger we are, fill in the blank, Jakarta, Bangkok. We're such bigger cities. We're the natural heart. We'll be trillion-dollar economies. And here we are, 25 years later from my first backpacking trips, where I still have the moleskin notepads where people would tell me these things. And a quarter century has gone by, and here we are. Singapore's gap has not been eroded by any right in these political economic dimensions. And yet everyone wins, to be clear. It's not zero sum, it's positive sum. But no one would say, I'm going to make my global hub for X, for a major capital business or in finance anywhere but Singapore.
Parag, as you said, Singapore has certainly benefited from an amazing, capable government, the rule of law, stability, which has allowed them to attract capital and entrepreneurs from all over the world. More recently, it is also benefiting from Chinese entrepreneurs moving to the country. Are they at all concerned about US-China conflict, or does it seem far away to them?
So I think you're raising several very important themes and buckets that we can look at almost sequentially. Foreign entrepreneurs coming to Singapore is what I was mentioning a minute ago. It's been happening for more than a decade. So it predates US-China rivalry. But with US-China rivalry, then you had another phase, which is the offshoring and the de-risking, which has also benefited Southeast Asia and Singapore. Then you have the next phase, which is, of course, Xi Jinping and his crackdown and ultra high net worth Chinese entrepreneurs and executives wanting to domicile their businesses in places where they could protect their wealth and diversify their asset base, including Singapore. And that COVID also had something to do with that on top of everything else. And with the post-COVID opening, if you put all of those together, you have what's happening every day right now in this little country, which is plane loads of ultra-high net worth Chinese coming and setting up their businesses here so they can de-Sinify themselves. That's from the entrepreneurial level. But of course, you also have leading Chinese companies, notably ByteDance, for example, saying the only way to be viewed as less Chinese of a Chinese company is to set up your international headquarters in Singapore and your governance there, your board there, so that you can convince the US Congress that you're not Chinese. So there's also that phenomenon. All of the above, sequentially and overlapping and reinforcing each other, are what has also helped Singapore from that standpoint too.
Yeah, good luck convincing the United States Congress that they're not Chinese.
Yeah, totally.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you see any local startups in Singapore becoming major international players? Give us a little preview.
So, sort of Singapore outbound, remember, Singapore will have its fingerprints on the biggest companies in the region like Grab, Gojek, and so forth, the super apps and the digital platforms. It is an anchor investor, Singapore Inc., as we say it here, whether it's going to be GIC, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, or Temasek as well, which is a large state-backed private equity fund. They have been involved in pretty much all the big stories from day one, right? They have privileged access. They, in the sense of everyone wants to have their imprimatur, right, and blessing. They're already very, very involved in that story. And those companies are, again, all either headquartered or co-domiciled here and elsewhere. So all those names that one already knows of already have Singapore's at least financial role in them. Whether or not the cutting edge technology was developed here or not is a different story because, of course, it's a very small country with a small labor force. So there's a regional village involved technologically. If you take one of the big tech firms in the region, C Group, SEA, it was previously known as Garena, huge gaming company listed in the New York Stock Exchange, and here very diversified, right? Definitely a Singapore story, but some of the most profitable arms of the company are gaming in one country and mobile payments in another country and e-commerce in a third country in this region. But it all rolls up back here to Singapore.
You have been bullish about this region, Parag, evidenced by your book, The Future is Asian, for a long time now. As someone who is constantly observing and analyzing trends, what other regions of the world are you bullish about?
It's a great question. I have a map which I like to show in presentations, and it has a triangle. And the triangle has one corner here in Southeast Asia, another corner in Saudi Arabia / the Gulf countries, the Arabian Gulf, Persian Gulf countries. And the third corner is up in Central Asia around Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And that triangle to me signifies really one of the most dynamic trans-regional intersections in the world today. And each of these three corners is really increasing its exposure and investment and trade with each other in diplomatic relations. So Gulf countries are investing a lot in Central Asia. Central Asia is learning a lot from the Gulf and from Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is trading a lot with the Gulf countries, and there's a lot of capital market activity as well. And Southeast Asia is investing a lot in Central Asia too and doing a lot of projects there. So this three-way triangle, all of which are what, people in the field call emerging markets, right? When you have three emerging market regions that are prospering, that have good governments, that have, really feature incredible dynamism, deepening their ties with each other at the same time, that's a great synergistic story. And by the way, geographically, the country that sits in the middle of that triangle is not China, it's India. Because India, of course, is younger, also growing, also reforming, has great relations with Southeast Asia, great relations with the Gulf countries, and great relations with Central Asia, right? No geopolitical tension among them. In fact, they have a lot of common interests as well. For example, concern over Chinese activity in the region, both in the maritime and terrestrial space. So to me, and this is a great, CSIS, subject to get into, is of course, what are the future dynamics among the corners of this triangle? And that to me is very exciting. So that's one of these skate to where the puck is going kinds of things. What are the geographies and interrelationships among geographies that we in Washington tend to not understand very well, but that are extraordinarily important for the future and are big game changers? This would be my number one pick, is the Gulf, Central Asia, Southeast Asia relationship. And as you can imagine, as you know very well, in DC, we don't talk about that because we obsess over US-China, US-China, US-China all day long.
How do you envision the future of global supply chains, especially in the context of Southeast Asia's growing role?
Absolutely. And this, gets into the region's organic growth as the result of being young and opening its economies to trade, and rising labor costs and friction with China and the de-risking and offshoring and so forth. All of those things happening at the same time have made Southeast Asia a real hub for global supply chains. And so that to me is a natural process simply by virtue of youthfulness and open regionalism and new trade agreements like TPP and RCEP and so forth. RCEP is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, largest regional trade agreement in the world right now. All the countries in this region practice what is known as open regionalism, which is that they don't want to pick sides. They actually want to be part of as many trade agreements as they possibly can. And that's evidenced by the fact that they, again, are not choosing sides. And you both alluded to this question earlier about how are they playing the US-China rivalry? Well, the answer is they always want to play all sides. And that reflects a strategy that I call multi-alignment. Never choose one side. Smart countries practice multi-alignment. They play all sides all the time. This was the topic of my first book, The Second World. It was a book about multi-alignment and the strategies of emerging markets in that space. So,
don't the United States and China ultimately try to make people choose sides?
Yes, but again, it's all about whether you view the dynamics in the world from the theoretical prism or the top-down prism and the aspirational prism of the US and China versus what's actually happening in the real world on the ground.
Yeah, great point.
Most of the time, countries are not letting themselves get cajoled into that trap. Now, it does happen. There are very concrete cases of countries saying, sorry, Huawei, you can't do business here, right? Sorry, no Chinese 5G telecommunication systems, no Chinese satellite launches. So one by one, case by case, yes. But most countries, most of the time, in most sectors, are saying, we want to trade a lot with China, we want investment from the United States, we'll do military exercises with both of you, and so we will maintain friendly relations. The way I've described that attitude is not just the term multi-alignment, but also the psychology behind it, which is so important to understand. And the psychology is so much more powerful than what America wants or what China wants. And that is the psychology of post-colonial countries, which have been the geographical remit of my work my whole life, because I'm born in a post-colonial country, India, and I've always grown up just sentimental about understanding that psychological disposition. So now you have a set of countries, which is, by the way, most countries and most people on Earth are post-colonial people in post-colonial countries. So I hereby speak on behalf of 80% of mankind when I say my parents' generation remembers colonialism, and they don't want to repeat that. And they remember the Cold War, in which you also were told you must choose sides. And of course, they don't want to do that either. So there's no way that you will convince the countries of the world today who have just emerged from colonialism and the Cold War that they should fall into those traps, one trap or the other again. And that means that they're suspicious of America and suspicious of China. And that's the important part. They are in it for themselves. And that is what multi-alignment is about. It's about saying, what's in it for me? How can I get the best deal? And I not only, to be quite frank, because we're talking about entrepreneurialism and even my entrepreneurial journey, that's literally what my professional career outside of academia and policy has been. I spend my time going to all of those so-called middle powers, emerging markets, and I actually coach them on how to play all sides. Quite frankly, part of the reason that some of these countries behave the way they do is because I and others like me literally guide and coach them in how to practice multi-alignment. They would have done it because they're psychologically predisposed to it, but navigating that is what helps them succeed and not falling into one trap or the other.
Yeah, it is certainly about what is in their best interest. Let me change gears, Parag, for a second and ask you about your own company. You are the CEO of Climate Alpha and also the founder of FutureMap. How do you see the intersection between climate, entrepreneurship, and now AI?
It is. And climate is this major, we think of it as an exogenous factor that is now disrupting global order in many, many ways. We think of it as a global governance challenge because it requires collective action and collective response. But it's very much a geographical issue because not all regions are going to be affected in the same way, at the same time scale, the same degree or intensity. And therefore, the degree of climate risk and climate adaptation of any country has to be factored into our calculation of its capacity to fulfill its fundamental duties and obligations to its citizens, to maintain its economic trajectory and its industrial base, and to remain a viable place to live and to invest and to thrive. And there are places in the world that I describe in my last book as vacant states. Places that are going to be so adversely affected by climate change that people will completely abandon them forever. Whereas other places are going to be collecting people and therefore gaining in power by way of having their demographics in a way replenished through climate migration just because they're climate resilient in their geography and policies. So the intersection of climate and demographics and adaptation and infrastructure.
And politics will get in the way as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that winds up becoming a causal factor, among others, in what determines the balance of power in the future. So that's why the approach that I took to starting the company, which, by the way, we're now calling AlphaGeo. So we're removing the word climate because it's not just climate. Our data sets on which we run these AI models are way more than climate. Climate is actually about 1/4 of our total data sets. We have data on corporate investment, on infrastructure, on demographics, on thousands of features, all of which are trained together. So we're actually called AlphaGeo, meaning alpha geography. And alpha, of course, is the term in markets for outperformance. So which will be the geographies that will perform best in a complex world? That's the question that we're actually answering.
In your work, you've cited the UAE as a good example of climate innovation. Can you explain why you think that?
It's a good example of climate adaptation. Now, climate change has dealt the Middle East, the West Asian countries, the Gulf countries a very bad hand. You have a hot desert climate that's going to get a lot hotter by every conceivable study or projection, unbearably, unlivably hot. Now, Andrew, I'd like you to answer this question. What is the fastest growing country in the history of the human species?
Well, that's a tough one.
It's the United Arab Emirates.
Really?
Oh,
So how can we reconcile these two things? A country whose population has increased 60x, that's 60-fold, from when it achieved independence in the early 1970s to today, while also every climate model saying that this place is unlivable. The answer is, of course, adaptation. World-class infrastructure, nuclear power, water desalination, coastal mangroves and seawalls, you name it, right?
Skiing in malls.
Indoor skiing is the first place my kids ever skied, was in that mall. Subsequently, fortunately, had the privilege of enjoying Japanese snow as well. But the point is that relative adaptation to the circumstances that you have been dealt by the climate future or by geopolitics are going to determine your success or failure. And the UAE is a success, even though climate change models tell you it is condemned. And the key thing about this is geography again, the catchment area or radius that you are examining, because the UAE does not have to be Switzerland to succeed. The UAE simply needs to be better off in adapting than Egypt or Yemen or Iran or Pakistan or India, and which it is, of course. And therefore I can name you 2 billion people who'd rather live in the UAE than where they live right now. And that will ever more be the case as climate change gets worse and worse. So you simply need to be better governed, better adapted, more attractive, more livable than your neighbors to succeed in a volatile climate environment. And that's what the UAE has done.
Besides the UAE, can you think of another country that has been as good either in innovating or in adaptation?
So, depending on how you look at it, if you measure it by, say, economic diversification in light of the fact that there's growing pressure on economies to decarbonize and to wean themselves off oil, then you'd be looking at countries that have undertaken that economic diversification. The UAE has started to do that. Malaysia is a diversified economy, even though it's a natural resource driven economy, but it also has a lot of technology, a lot of services, very good infrastructure, and so on. But I tend to look at this particular question that you've raised country by country because each country's climate circumstances are quite different. So the time that they have available to them to undertake this adaptation is very, very different. A country like Kazakhstan, again, benefits from climate change, right? It's becoming a major food producer. It's becoming warmer, and they are diversifying too. Around the world, as you look, each country has to figure out what the adverse or positive impacts are going to be in the future and plan accordingly. No two countries are going to do it exactly the same way.
Parag, before we go, we'd like to ask you what we ask all of our guests. What advice would you give to young entrepreneurs looking to make a positive impact in the environment today?
Ooh, that's a good one. My boilerplate advice for young people is always to travel. That's going to be advice number one always, because that's kind of my passion and my methodology for things. But speaking specifically about entrepreneurship and in particular, the impact journey you're describing, I guess there's two answers. One is genuine, kind of native entrepreneurs. Let's say I'm just a latecomer to entrepreneurship, but they always say, find a problem to solve, right? And I think that is very important. I've learned that now through the rough and tumble of the last couple of years of running, starting this company is, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? And ideally you pick a big enough problem where there's a real scale demand for it, such that your solution is not just a hobby, but something that can bring about a systemic change. And I think that's really important. Systems change is really a key thing. There's a lot of philanthropy and impact kind of work that is trying to solve a problem at a small scale. But generalizing that solution is really the most important part of success. So think about microcredit. Well, microcredit originated with, experiments, right? Bangladesh prominently and other places like with the Grameen Bank. But the whole world needs it, right? Even wealthy countries have microcredit kinds of schemes. And you marry that with fintech, which has been rapidly evolving, and you have the emergence of P2P capitalism and P2P debt markets and so on. And that's really systems change, right? You've introduced an entire new way of doing finance that the world needed. Advice for entrepreneurs is definitely think at that scale of where the market failures are and try and attack that. That's really where we set out to say, look, everyone is focused on mitigation. Every company in the world wants to decarbonize, but adaptation is getting neglected, right? What infrastructure do you need? What are the new housing and urban developments? Where do you do all of the desalination projects? That's adaptation. And we're mapping that out. And we see that just people were not talking about it, not investing in it. At the COP summits, they always point out nowadays, 96% of all the investment that's going into climate is going into mitigation. 4% is going into adaptation. And our bet is that needs to balance out. And when it does, or as it does, that's trillions of dollars of spending that's going to go into adaptation. And those are the numbers that you hear Bank of America and BlackRock and others saying we need to spend on adaptation. So with our tiny little baby startup, our goal is to say what piece of that adaptation market can we capture? And that's just, a micro story about how to think about what problem you want to solve as an entrepreneur.
Parag, I cannot thank you enough for such an interesting conversation and for painting a very compelling picture as to the growth and dynamism that is occurring in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world, particularly because here in North America, we tend to see things through a much more narrow lens, and we really forget how big and interesting the world is. So thank you so much.
Such a pleasure. Thank you both. And again, congratulations.